For those who didn't hear me, good morning. Thank you, Sean. We've come to a very important passage in the New Testament. That is the Mount of Transfiguration experience. And I always open the wrong one. See, I do the PowerPoint and then I save it on the disk to bring over here, and then the PowerPoint on mine is on a different file. How we doing? Okay. There's our disclaimer. Let's move to the next slide, please. The Transfiguration. Now, in Luke, this event, we got Bible reading. Yes, please. We always did this previously, but after COVID, we shortened the service down, and so I forgot. But Sarah always does a good job at listening to some of the old sermons, trying to get them ready to put up on YouTube, and she read quite a number of times over the years. Go ahead.
All right. Do you want me to read now?
Yes.
Okay. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men then, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he had said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen, listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days no one told any of the things that they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg of you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will not scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not.
Thank you, Sarah. Good job. Okay, so this is called the Transfiguration. Now, in biology class back in the Stone Age, they taught us about metamorphosis, how the monarch worm gets on the plant, and then it develops I forget what they call it, one of them, I think the third one is the pupa. It turns into something else. It turns from a worm into a butterfly, and most moths and butterflies do this, and the Greek word metamorphosis is the word that is used to change from one form to another, and this is the exact word that is used. Jesus was metamorphized. He was changed into the real essence of who he is. And so that's what we're talking about today. Next slide. About 8 days, both Matthew and Mark say, after 6 days. So we can assume here that they were on the mountain a couple of days. So about 8 days, but it does say about, it could be 7, it could be 6, it could be 9, about a week later after these sayings. What were the sayings that this is referring to? It's when they were walking on the road to Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus said to the 12, "Who do people say that I am?" And they said, "Well, John the Baptist with his head restored, or one of the Old Testament prophets, or Elijah." And as we talked about last week, Peter came up and spoke on behalf of the disciples that you are the Son of the living God. And Matthew tells us that Jesus said, This is the rock on which I will build my church. So it says after these things, about a week after that happened, so they're in the north country. Well, they could have come south some. I don't know. It doesn't say, but it was about a week later. Now, there were the 3, there were the 12, and there were the 70. If you look carefully at, oh no, I'm going to cough again. Sorry. Did you turn me down? If you look at the New Testament, you'll see that it tells you who Jesus was speaking to. Now, these 3 are mentioned together very often, and these 3 were on the Mount of Transfiguration. They were also in the Garden of Gethsemane, which is where Jesus was praying before he went to the cross. In the healing of the daughter in the synagogue, these 3 were there. When it mentions the apostles, it always puts these 3 names first. They were the closest to Jesus. Now, James was the first one that was murdered. His murder is recorded in the book of Acts. So that left Peter and Andrew as the closest. I tried cutting out coffee, that didn't do it. While he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. The word is like a lightning strike. It kind of indicates that this was a nighttime event, although it doesn't particularly say that this was at night. But Luke seems to indicate that it was. And so Jesus became so bright that it appeared like lightning. Now, Jesus has also appeared in another event where he appeared to John in the book of Revelation. He appeared to John in this way as well. And of course, John was there at this event and at that event as well. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Metamorphosis, next slide, we already talked about that. So there they are on the mountain. It says that they were sleepy, they were tired, they woke up, and they saw Moses and Elijah. Now Moses, as you know, was the person who started Judaism. He was the person who wrote the first 5 books of Moses, although not the whole of the last first 5 books, because his death is recorded in the last book. But Moses died on the mountain, and it says God buried him in the valley, and that nobody knew where his grave was. Elijah, who also appeared on the Mount of Transfiguration in this event, he's the one who was carried up into heaven on a cloud, and his understudy, Elisha, had been praying that he would receive a double portion of Elijah's ministry and his spirit, his miraculous workings. And Elijah had said to Elisha, well, if my mantle falls on you, then you will receive the double portion. So these 2 people had a death which did not produce a known grave. Why didn't they do that? We'll talk about that in a little minute. It says here in Luke that when they appeared with Elijah and Moses, who also represent the law and the prophets, because Elijah was the greatest of the prophets, and they're there and they're speaking face to face with Jesus, and they are already glorified themselves. They already have a glorified body. And so this is how we can see that when the saints of God pass away, they exist. They're not merely in the grave waiting for a resurrection. The church has argued for years, well, are they dead until the resurrection? And then they raise. Well, here we see that at least Moses and Elijah are in the presence of God. They're not still in their grave. In fact, Elijah didn't even have a grave. Moses did, but nobody knew where it was. And Luke is the only one that tells us that what they were talking about, to turn away when I use the handkerchief, which Everybody uses a handkerchief. I don't know why I have to turn away. The Luke is the only one who tells us that when Jesus was on this mountain and he's speaking to these two greatest of the prophets, that he was talking about what he is about to do in Jerusalem. Now, scholars tell us that this is about 6 months before the death of Jesus. And if we keep going at this pace, maybe we will get to the right spot at Easter time, 6 months from now, as we're going through Luke. So this is like 2.5 years into the ministry of Jesus. He is working in Galilee and Nazareth and up in the North Country, and now he's starting to go towards Jerusalem. And he's actually, you'll see in the days ahead, he actually becomes a troublemaker. He calls people out on the stuff that they're doing. He tips over the money changer in the temple. He calls out people that are not doing the right thing. And so he's talking with Moses and Elijah. He's not talking with the disciples, but the disciples are there and they're hearing the conversation. And so the week before, while they were walking in Caesarea Philippi, Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said, "Yeah, but I'm going to Jerusalem and I'm going to be put to death." And they couldn't hear it. And here they're seeing a very supernatural event where Jesus is changed before them, and the same thing is being told to them. But even at this point, they still can't hear it. They still say, "No, that can't possibly be what you're here to do. This can't possibly be the way." And think about it. It doesn't really make sense with your brain that Jesus could die for our sins or in our place. It doesn't really, to the human thinking, it's almost like if that's what God wants, that he's a child abuser or something like that. But he was coming to fulfill the law, to be a sacrifice on our behalf. And so he's talking with these people who were the greatest of the prophets in the Old Testament, and they apparently already knew what Jesus was sent for because they were in the place with God. And so Jesus himself had to kind of psych himself up to do it. If you look at the story in the Garden of Gethsemane, if possible, I don't want to do this, but nevertheless, not my will, but yours, God. And so here he's talking about the remainder of his ministry, which is going to be confrontational, and it's going to end in his death. Next slide. Here's an artist's depiction of Jesus among the 7 churches in the book of Revelation. Of course, John wrote that. So this is not the first time. This actually is the first time, and the Revelation is the second time that he sees the glorified Jesus walking amongst the churches, bright like lightning, bright like the sun in the noonday. So Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they stayed awake, they saw his glory, and the 2 men stood with him. It seems like every time that Jesus was doing something important, these 3 guys were there, and yet they were asleep or half asleep the whole time. And even when they were awake, they didn't quite get it, kind of like us. Next slide. And just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let's make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Let's build 3 cathedrals." Isn't that the human way? I mean, you drive around the area and you see those little blue signs with the gold lettering around it, and thus and so happened here. This is where this tavern was. This is where this company was. This is where this canal used to be. You see these things because we want to remember exactly where things happened. And so it was their idea that there should be a place where they could come to and re-experience this wonderful thing that they saw, because then they can kind of be on top and they can kind of be the boss. And if you look at we'll talk about this in a week or two, they also came to the place where they thought of themselves as being the more spiritual of the 3. Because as they came down and after Jesus took care of the boy with epilepsy and they're walking along and they're discussing with each other, which one will be the greatest? And we have the mother of, was it James and John, I think? The mother of James and John came and said, we want our sons to be on your right hand and on your left. And Jesus said, well, you don't know what you're asking for because I'm on my way to Jerusalem to give my life. Are they able to undergo what I'm about to undergo? Oh, yeah, we can do it. We can do it. We're more spiritual than the other 9 disciples, and especially Judas. We know he's no good. But they didn't actually know that because Judas was actually among the most trusted of them all because he was the treasurer, Paula. And he was not an honest treasurer like you are. He used to, they didn't have everything be paid by check. By the way, if you can pay by check, please pay by check. It's a lot easier on everybody. No. Yeah.
Don't lick the envelope, just tuck it in. Free church.
Well, yeah, Keith licks every 10th envelope. So don't lick the envelope. Yeah, it makes it easier for those who count. How did I get on that? Always a good time for a teaching moment. It's good for us to be here. Let's build 3 houses, 1 for each of you. Next slide, please. Can you imagine going to Israel? Well, if they did that, we would know where it is. And if you look at the scholars, they say, well, we think it's on Mount Tabor, but we don't know. It might be on Mount Hermon. And there's no place to pinpoint where this manifestation happened. Do you remember when they killed Osama bin Laden? They said to themselves, if we allow him to be buried someplace, then that will become a shrine and all these crazies will come and worship at the shrine. So they took him, and according to an acceptable Islamic practice, they took him and dumped him in the sea. Because they didn't want a place where people could come and worship. That's the same reason why Moses was buried by God and nobody knew where he was buried. And if you look at one of the letters in the New Testament, it talks about the devil disputing with Michael the archangel about the body of Moses. Apparently the devil wanted there to be a monument to Moses somewhere, and the archangel said, no, there can be no place where people come to and make that the center of their religion. And so we have 2 people, Moses, the greatest lawgiver, Elijah, the greatest miracle-working prophet, and immediately the disciples say, well, we need a place like this. But to have a place, to have a monument to this event was going to be defeating to the point of what happened. And so it says they didn't know what they said. They didn't really understand the implications of what they were asking for. Next slide. Now, in the Old Testament times, back under Moses, they built a tabernacle, which was a little temple, but it was a tent, and it had the Ark of the Covenant in it. It had the incense burner and the 7-branch lampstand, and had the laver where they could wash stuff, and there was a sacrifice outside, and they brought blood in. They brought to represent the blood of the animal, which forgave the sinner as they presented their offering. All this ceremonial religion occurred, and so during the night, wherever this tent was placed, during the night there was a pillar of fire on it, and during the day there was a pillar of smoke. And so the 12 tribes, 3 tribes would be on the east, and 3 tribes would be on the north, and 3 tribes would be on the west. They would camp around it, and 3 tribes would be on the south. And as long as that cloud by day and fire by night remained on the tent of meeting, on the tabernacle, they would camp, whether it was 1 day or 10 years. And they followed that for 40 years. And that cloud was called the Shekinah glory. It was a glory cloud which the presence of God existed within it. And many years later, when the kingdom was founded and King Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem, he prayed that glory cloud would come down on the temple and that the people would see it and the people would worship the presence of God no matter where they were from. They would put their face towards Jerusalem and pray towards Jerusalem because that cloud or the presence of God was there. And so this cloud that overshadowed them on the mountain was this glory cloud, because it says glory several times. It was the presence, the scary, fearful, frightful presence of God in one place, and they were terrified of it. Back in the day, Moses said to God, I want to see your glory. And God said, if you really see my glory, you won't live. It'll kill you. And he said, get here in the cleft of the rock. And you know that song, Rock of Ages? That's what this is about. There's a little crack in the rock here. You stay inside that crack, and I'll pass by, and you can see my behind. Not behind, I mean the rear of God, the rear of the glory or the presence of God. So Moses was able to see that in his lifetime. And in the book of Maccabees, which is not a Bible book, but they were expecting that the cloud would reappear when Messiah would come, and I've given you the reference there. Next slide. Then from the cloud, the voice, this is my son, the chosen, listen to him. Matthew says it this way. While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them. From the cloud a voice said, this is my son, the beloved, with him I am well pleased. Listen to him. Now, we talked about this last year when we were going through Samuel, the books of Samuel, that the prophecy, the coming of the Messiah, would be the son of David. And if you look at the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1, it's a genealogy from David to Jesus, of the royal line. And when Jesus said to the people in the crowd, whose son is the Messiah? They always answered David's son, because in the scriptures it's very clear the Messiah would be a descendant from David. And David means beloved in Hebrew. And so literally, if you were reading this in Hebrew, that would say, this is my Ben, my son, David. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. Now they would listen to Moses, obviously, the 603 laws of Moses. They would read the prophets, obviously, because they knew all about Elijah and Elisha and the kingdom. And, you know, the kingdom stories, it's the official word of the politicians, and then the prophets are the people that were antithetical to the stated order of the politicians. And so we like to read about the kingdom, but we don't like to read the prophets too much. It gets too much to our personal sins. So God speaks and points out to these three men in a very visible, terrifying, enlightening way that this is the Messiah indeed. And no matter what, these people never denied Jesus. They lived their life until they were put to death, and they were put to death. Peter was crucified upside down. They said, deny Jesus or we're going to crucify you. He said, crucify me upside down. I'm not worth it. John, they poked his eye out and put him on the Isle of Patmos. He's there working as a slave on the isle as an old man, and he receives the vision of Revelation. It cost them everything, but they saw it and they refused to deny it because they met with God. They actually personally met Moses, and they personally met Elijah, if you can imagine that. I mean, just think of it, the experience that these people had, that really nobody else, not any of the other 9 disciples had this. In fact, they weren't even allowed to tell them. Can you imagine? No, when we get back down tomorrow morning, the other 9 will be there. Don't tell them about this. What a test of obedience that was. Of course, Moses predicted that Jesus would come. In fact, he said if anybody didn't listen to that prophet who's to come, who is Jesus, that God will require it of them. Next slide. And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was there alone. And there was silence. That's my favorite part about being with Jesus. They made us, when I was in seminary, we had to buy a DVD, and it was 3 DVDs set. And all it was a recording in a monastery, a silent monastery in Europe. And nobody was allowed to talk. That's what they do. They get up in the morning at 3 a.m. They sing the Gregorian chants, and then they go to work, and everything is very regulated. There's a book of hours, so you do exactly the same thing every single day. But what you realize is that there is no such thing as pure silence. There's the steps of people going into the kitchen. There's the pan coming down on the stove. There's the jet flying over the top. But it was almost excruciating to sit there. I don't know how long it was, but how long does it take for 3 DVDs? I think it was like 6 hours or something of it. It was really cool, but I wish that I could have rented it instead of bought it. But you know how it is. They probably get some sort of kickback from those things when you're in school. I don't know. But there was silence. Crickets, so to speak. Probably not any frogs. They're on top of the mountain. Depending on the time of day, there'd be owls hooting, or there might be crows or ravens screeching. But it was such an experience that it basically struck them dumb. I mean unable to speak. An experience so great that they couldn't even contemplate talking about it, even though they were warned not to talk about it, but they just didn't and couldn't talk about it. Next slide. Peter, later, in 2 Peter, writes this: "We did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we had been eyewitnesses of his majesty." Now this is even today, this is the criticism of the Bible. The Bible is just a bunch of myths. It's just a commonly agreed upon religion that, somebody made up. Well, I'll tell you, you're not going to make up a religion that's going to cost you crucifixion upside down. You're not going to stick up for something that you didn't actually see. When they poke your eye out, all you have to do is say, "No, I didn't see it." It's like Watchman Nee. He kept preaching. They said, if you don't stop preaching in this prison, we're going to cut your tongue out. And he didn't stop preaching, and they cut his tongue out. These are the types of things that, if you want a horror book, don't read Stephen King. Read Fox's Book of Martyrs, of what happened to the early disciples and the early apostles when they refused to deny Jesus. Peter says, these things that we're preaching, they're not myths that were made up. It says in verse 17, he received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice was conveyed to him by the majestic glory, which is the Shekinah glory, saying, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I'm well pleased." This is the Matthew version. Verse 18. "We ourselves," that is Peter, James, and John, "heard this voice come from heaven, and while we were with him on the holy mountain. So since we have a message more fully confirmed, you will do well to be attentive to this as a lamp shining in a dark place until the day dawns." When will the day dawn? When the Messiah comes back in the brightness of the sun, as lightning flashes across the sky from the east to the west, riding on a cloud. The day dawns, and the morning star rises in your heart. So Peter, later on, before his death, when they criticized him and they said, you can't prove this stuff and it's just faith and there's no empirical evidence, he said, well, I have empirical evidence myself because I saw it with my own eyes. And Jesus really was transfigured and became bright. And Moses really did show up and speak to us. And Elijah certainly spoke to us as well. And Jesus was changed before our very eyes. He was metamorphosed into his glorified body in our very presence, and we cannot deny it. Therefore, you ought to pay attention to what we're saying. Next slide. Now, here we have, I don't know if you can see this very well. This is Raphael's The Transfiguration. And it's really cool because it shows Moses and Elijah, Jesus very bright in the air, and Moses and Elijah on either side, and the disciples underneath them sleeping. And at the bottom of the mountain, the crowd with the epileptic boy. What a different, meanwhile, back at the ranch type of expression. People are hurting. People are sick. People need Jesus. The spiritual experience had not yet reached into their lives. The spiritual experience, maybe not the transfiguration experience, but the spiritual experience of the presence of God, maybe without the cloud and maybe without the lightning strike, is what these people on the bottom of the mountain need. And the other 9 disciples are down there and they can't help the kid. I mean, isn't the Bible an interesting story? Now, metamorphosis is used in 2 other places in the New Testament. That word is not used in Luke, but it's used in Matthew and Mark concerning this story. Luke has the longest version of the transfiguration, but Luke doesn't use the word transfiguration. In Romans it says, do not be conformed to this world, but be metamorphized by the renewing of your mind. How do you renew your mind? Well, you can start by not reading porno. You can start by not reading trash books. You can start by reading the scriptures and asking God to show you what's right, to ask him to forgive you where you've been wrong and to not be wrong anymore, to repent from sins. That's how you can get your mind renewed. You need a biblical mindset, that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. Don't be like a worldly person. Get your mind renewed. Now, we call that, I guess, brainwashed, in a good sense. Cults brainwash us in a bad sense, but the scriptures, the Word of God, the Spirit of God in our hearts will renew our minds so that we can think properly and we can make decisions properly. And then 2 Corinthians says, we all, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being metamorphosed into the same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord, the Spirit. When Moses came down off the mountain, his face, I'm talking about Old Testament when Moses went on the mountain. He came down off the mountain, and his face was so bright because he had been transfigured before the Israelites, some 2,000 years BC. His face was so bright, he had to put a veil over it. So that's what this is referring to. We all with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of God, being transformed into the same image from glory to glory. This is the goal of Christianity, to clean us up and to make us a light for the world. I went over 5 minutes, but I just want to read you the next verse from the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Now, aside from the lilies thing, that's what this verse is about. Christ was born across the sea with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. He died to make men holy. Let us die to make men free while God is marching on. That's what that verse means. It means that we have to be walking in the right direction. We have to be the light of God. Are there any comments or questions? Creasy has one back here.
One day I was having a very nice prayer
Can you speak
time.
up a little? I can't hear you. Just talk right into it.
One day I was having a very nice prayer time, and I was weeping and crying and thanking the Lord and praising Him for all that He had to go through for my salvation. And I was carrying on, and He said, "But aren't you glad I did?" And then we had such a great time of rejoicing. It was wonderful.
Awesome. Anyone else? What an aha moment that was. How about you, Gene?
So one of the things that really struck me when you were speaking is, when the Israelites were on their exodus and they were in the wilderness and they were traveling and they didn't have a stationary home and they were moving from place to place upon, they were being guided by God. And you mentioned the pillar, the cloud in the not, in the daytime and the fire. I did a little reading at that same time, and in Exodus what it says is that the Spirit of the Lord settled over the tabernacle in the cloud that was so bright that at night it appeared to be fire. So it made me think, I wonder if the glory of God that was leading the Israelites was this cloud of His presence, and it appeared at night like fire. It was still the cloud. And the reason it appeared like fire is because Jesus was in that presence of God. It kind of supports our whole theology of the 3-in-1, that pillar was a physical 3-in-1, and it was leading the Israelites through a wilderness, just like we're supposed to allow God in the 3-in-1 to lead us through a wilderness. We call it society, civilization, the world, but we're supposed to be focused on the 3-in-1. It struck me, it kind of tied it all together. I think that maybe we teach it wrong to our kids when we say there's a cloud in the daytime and a pillar of fire at night. I think it's all the same.
Of course it is.
And it appears, it's so bright and it's flashing with the presence of Jesus that it appears as fire at night. So that struck me. Second thing, and this goes with what Creasy said, we should not weep when a Christian dies. Pastor Hammond passed. He has escaped now the trials of the flesh. And a true Christian, we should be rejoicing that he has been successful in his life to be at a point where now he's passed out of that into eventual glory.
The poor guy the reason that I was called in back in 1989 was because his back was so bad that he had to go get back surgery, and then he got in an accident after that, and so the last years of his life have been nothing but pain. And when he was here for the funeral here less than 6 months ago, I don't know exactly when it was, February, I guess, more than 6 months ago, less than a year ago, he barely could move, and so he's free from that. Anyone else? Okay, we're going to take communion together today, and the first thing I'm going to do is look for 2 volunteers to help me, and I will get a list so that we have people ready each Communion Sunday for the rest of the year, and I'll have that here next week.